Hi, everyone. Welcome to the first and last word poetry series. And I'm very excited to see all of you tonight. And we have three really wonderful readers. Harris and I are very excited about having them here tonight. Neil Silberblatt, Ellen Steinbaum, and Elizabeth Wolf. So welcome to tonight. And our first reader is Neil Silberblatt. He is the founder, director of Voices of Poetry. His poems have appeared in numerous literary journals, including Plume, Mom Egg, Lily Poetry Review, Tiferet Journal, American Journal of Poetry, and Tikkun Daily. Neil's poetry collections are So Far, So Good in Present Tense and Past Imperfect, nominated for the Mass Book Award in poetry. He has been nominated several times for a Pushcart Prize and has conducted classes and workshops at Snow Library in Orleans, Massachusetts, and at the Mount, Edith Wharton's home, and Lenox. And I give you Neil.
Thank you so very much. And thank you to Harris and Gloria for hosting this series and for inviting me to share my work. I'll start off with a poem which explains the headgear. My beloved, knowing of my fondness for films noir and fedoras specifically, or purchased a fedora for me from an online hat merchant. And when we could not find that information about the hat's arrival, and we got responses which sounded like they were from a computer, we assumed that it was a scam, and we notified the credit card company, etc. A month afterwards, a box arrived at our door. Inside the box was a smaller box. Inside the smaller box was this hat, which I now wear. And I realized I had to write a poem, not just a poem, but a sonnet, and not just a sonnet, but I would attempt a crown of sonnets. So what I came up with was a fedora of sonnets, which is 3 shy of a crown. 4 sonnets linked together by, well, you'll hear. Ode to a Borsellino, a fedora of sonnets. 1. Perhaps it was the meaningless response from the online hat merchant who promised the finest in headwear shipped to your door. The weather is so hot, the courier is try his best, and he has worked so hard, which led us to believe the whole thing was a scam. We, clever us, had been duped, fooled, like Bogart was by Mary Astor, or Greenstreet when he lied about the black bird, or Walter Neff was by Phyllis Dietrich before the bullets fled their guns' chambers. We chalked it up to experience and slid on the slipper of cynicism, so smooth you don't notice the stone inside. 2. So smooth you don't notice the stone inside until the twist ending, the one you did not see coming until the final frame. The healing of the blind and the crippled, the stone rolled away from the empty tomb, the water transformed into Chianti, the slaying of the firstborn as night fell, the parting of the Red Sea, just in time. The Borsellino arrived at our door, mocking our doubts and cheap cynicism, shaming our disbelief with newfound hope. As surprising as that now empty tomb, we did not dare to expect to see this, perhaps because the weather is so cold. 3. Perhaps because the weather is so cold, some say 80% of the body's heat is lost through an uncovered head. And I love that they can approximate this, as though gauging that loss were as simple as a thermometer under a tongue. More likely it is that 80% of our faith is lost through experience and awaits some head covering as soft as a gray Borsellino fedora. Hope is not that thing with feathers which perches on the soul, but rather a worn felt hat with a wide brim and silk ribbon, safeguarding my heat and hope from escape. 4. Safeguarding my heat and hope from escape, it rests upon my head as easily as the yarmulke once did as a child, when I still believed in miracles and was convinced of God's grace and forgiveness. This hat will take its place and conceal the loss of hair in the new round of chemo, which may keep the beast from spreading further and allow me to remain vertical a while longer to enjoy this hat and the woman who gifts me with hat and love, while anointing my head with holy oil, waiting for some divine intercession, perhaps even a meaningful response. Thank you.
Wow.
A poem, I'm sorry? Oh, thank you.
I said, wow.
Thank you. A poem which, despite its title, will tell you nothing about how to build a fire. How to build a fire. Start slowly, no, slower, with longing or perhaps a lemon cut along its pregnant midsection and squeezed over plump scallops, seared to a walnut finish, while their flesh recalls the ocean. Nurse it with desire, or perhaps garlic, roasted until its sweet pulp emerges Minerva-like from its parchment skin, like Torah scrolls whose crowned letters leap from flames. Only then add touch, or perhaps logs, whose air pockets wait to be emptied by pickpocket flames, releasing ash fireflies like so many copper pennies scattered onto the night's floor. Skip the fire pit. You don't even need matches. Just start with kindling, or perhaps a poem about kindling. Since we are approaching, not quickly, but approaching the Jewish high holidays, I thought this poem might be appropriate. I was asked to describe the Jewish laws surrounding keeping kosher. Disclaimer, I no longer keep kosher. Sorry, Mom. But this poem was the response, the poetic response to the laws of kashrut. Kashrut. To keep kosher, you must separate the milk from meat, the pure from the impure, the sacred from the profane. You must segregate the food, herd the designated and ritually slaughtered animals into their refrigerated ghettos where they cannot be contaminated by contact with the unclean. To keep kosher, you must draw the blade against the jugular, quickly and with a single stroke, let it bleed out and cook each to its own. You must boil the spoon or fork, which has landed briefly in the wrong drawer, or bury the plate which has borne the forbidden in the earth, where it can absorb the ashes from the remains of the kosher. You must be prepared to discard the impure, to slaughter your second-born, to banish your firstborn, to claim your brother's birthright, to deceive your elderly half-blind father, to bury your brother and leave him for dead, to bear suffering with Bancha Schweig-like silence, and to wait 3 hours between devouring the kid and drinking its milk. You must renounce all manners of shellfish and your brother and his children if they transgress, and stand silent as they are swallowed by the earth. Above all, you must purify your soul, soaking it in brine for the requisite millennia until it hardens before roasting, and hope that when you are done, it is pleasing to God and his people. When I was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer, a dear friend asked if I'd made arrangements. Never asked that question of somebody who's been diagnosed with cancer. Here's my response. Final requests. When it's my turn at bat, skip the cremation. Enough of my tribe have been shoved into ovens. No need to eat my meager rations. Instead, roast me like coffee, till my bones attain a darker hue like my beloved. Then measure out my days into a French press, where you can label me robust, complex, and at long last, rich. Or, once the angel of death has koshered me, as my Zadie did to chickens and goats, never calves, whose eyes he said were too much like a child's, giving thanks to the Almighty with each gentle stroke of his sharp blade, cook me slowly over a low flame, as my mother did with flanken, starting on early Friday afternoon, so it would be ready in time for Shabbos, until the meat fell off the bone with a glance. Then perhaps those who are curious, or maybe hungry, can see and taste how a poet burns. some newer poems. If you're not familiar with the term kintsukuroi, it is a Japanese term. It refers to repairing broken pottery with lacquer dusted or mixed with powdered gold, silver, or platinum. It treats breakage and repair as part of the history of an object rather than as something to disguise. Kintsukuroi. First, it must be broken. I would recommend dropped from a modest height or humbled by circumstance. Second, the shards, which must be gathered jagged piece by jagged piece, must not be easily reassembled by all the king's horses or all the king's men. Third, the precious metals must, like us, be ground into dust, particulates no longer recognizable as precious, until they can be reduced to molten metal and poured out, like us. Then, and only then, can you start. One of my favorite parables from the 5 books of Moses, or the Old Testament, as some people call them, is the story of the binding or sacrifice of Isaac, on which I have a very different take. It begins with this epigram. After these events, God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham. Abraham answered, I am here. God said, take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the land of Moriah. Offer him up as an entirely burnt offering there in one of the mountains that I will show you. Genesis chapter 22, verses 1 through 2. Burnt offering. When the order was given, no questions were asked. Not what kind of binding should be used, cloth or leather straps. Not how his hands should be bound, reef knot or blood knot. Not whether the boy should be told or given a chance to flee before the butchering began. Not whether the boy would feel pain. Not even why. Like Stanley Milgram's experiment, in which the test subjects obediently complied, administering incrementally higher shocks despite the screams, Abraham went along, just following orders. There is no mention of how loudly Isaac screamed or begged for his life. There is no mention of whether, after that afternoon, he again went with his father for a walk in the woods, or could look him in the eye, or what they discussed that night over dinner. Another favorite passage is the interchange between Esau and Jacob, when Jacob asks for Esau's birthright. And, well, I'll let the poem describe it with his epigraph. Quote, when Jacob had cooked stew, Esau came in from the field and he was famished. And Esau said to Jacob, please, let me have a swallow of that red stuff there, for I am famished. But Jacob said, first, sell me your birthright. Genesis chapter 25, verses 29 through 34. That red stuff. What fine stew that must have been. What aroma to whet that biblical appetite. What lentils to warrant so steep a price. What brother would have exacted such a price from his sweating brother, fresh from the field, with the smell of dung still upon him, demanding that it be tendered before a drop of stew could pass his lips? What would Jacob have demanded, or Esau have forsaken, for a warm bowl of borscht, with a nice piece of black bread and sweet butter? For a plate of kosher varnishkas with simmered onions, he might have given up the holy sites and spared us all this bloodshed. For those who may not know the term, pogrom refers to a ethnic cleansing, if you wish, a mini Holocaust. It was kind of a dress rehearsal for the real Holocaust. I wrote this following one of my ablation. Ablation, for those who don't know, is a procedure where they burn the cancer cells out of you. Pogrom. My cancer cells have wandered off again from their point of origin, where they were never truly welcome. Like my forebearers, they have packed their few belongings, a pair of candlesticks, some books, a tea service, family photos, mementos mori, nothing too heavy to carry. They seek refuge in some remote village, in Belarus, Moldova, my liver, where they are not truly welcome, waiting for the next forced diaspora, their bags not unpacked just in case. They hope to make their home there, to lay down roots, maybe put some books on their shelves to avoid detection or further persecution. I, on the other hand, eagerly look forward to the next pogrom. On a lighter note, is proof that I have some sense of humor. Let me find this over here. A poem from my father, actually before that. My father, like so many of his generation, served in World War II, was one of the boys at the beach, but never ever spoke of his service. Until after he died, we came upon letters that he had written and wished that he had shared some of that experience. Odysseus at home. When he returned home, he hung up the uniform, the blood-stained sandals placed in a corner of the closet where he would not find them or they him. He did not speak of the war or warriors, the siege of Troy, the return of Hector's body to Priam and Hecuba. After all, what was he to Hecuba? The nightmares he did not share except every so often, late at night, when the horses reared in the stable, he awoke and waited to hear if men were disgorged from their stomachs. When Telemachus demanded stories from his father, he made up some stuff about sirens or men turned into pigs, which was not far from the truth. And a poem I wrote after the Tree of Life shooting in Pittsburgh. The term Korea, the title, is the traditional rending of garments by someone who has experienced loss of a loved one. Interestingly, the Hebrew term for tearing or ripping is a different term. Korea only refers to the rending of garments when one is in mourning. Korea. If, in accordance with tradition, I rent my garments with each slaughter, each pogrom, each shooting, for each victim piled high like those mountains of glasses which we'll never again see. If, like Job, I tore at my clothes with each loss, by the end, I would be standing naked before you. And then perhaps you might finally notice that, like you, I am human. This was occasioned by a conversation overheard on buses, which is why you should always keep a pad and pen nearby. Prepositions. On our shared bus ride, my neighbors are discussing walls, and one says that America was built upon immigrants, and the other nods in silent accord. And I too agree, yet want to correct him that the word he meant to use was for, or by, or with. But I keep silent. Upon will serve. It too is correct, as battlefields are built upon soldiers. This poem was my daughter lives in Israel, and she's a reporter. And this was occasioned by a news story in Al Jazeera. Quote, farmers in the West Bank watched helplessly as Israeli settlers chopped down hundreds of olive trees on their land. Settlers also took bulldozers used to work the agricultural fields. Right of return. The right of return, by the way, refers to the right any Jew to return to the state of Israel, even though Palestinians don't have that right. You moving your couch or mowing this olive grove, you speak of your right of return, as though you knew the precise address and apartment number where Elijah left his things before he ascended. Even Isaac never returned home after that afternoon. Ishmael, too, exiled with his mother, was not allowed to come back and reclaim his old bedroom. But you, with your rake, shovel, and bulldozer, you claim this as your own. You are a trespasser here. You are the man so desperate for a bed that he breaks into the wrong house. See the women and children asleep in their beds. See the dishes in the sink. That is not your wife. Those are not your children. Those are not your dishes, and that is most certainly not your olive grove. I thought I'm probably up to my time limit. So a memory poem, which is a slightly sweeter and perhaps it takes place in the summer of 1963. Nothing in the world. It is the summer of unalloyed light through torn screen doors of front porches, when 4 colored girls could go to Sunday school and return safely home, before launching pads would be spotted, before Khrushchev's shoe and Stevenson's dare, before Apollo's red glare, before the book depository, before the fall. In the kitchen of a bungalow we do not own stands, no, crouches, a woman who is my mother, still young and beautiful, her dark hair curled long before her spine would follow suit, who applies tincture dot by dot to the arms and legs of her youngest boy, and not quite but soon to be 6-year-old, who is me, a Surratt of calamine. In a bungalow colony outside Monticello, which Jefferson would not recognize, colonized by refugees from Poland, Hungary, and Queens, a polyglot of languages migrates without papers through the uninsulated walls, interrupted only by the hum of mammoth hunter fans, which would cool any volcano. If one listened carefully, one could hear Mittel Europa meet Grand Concourse with all local stops in between. In the bedroom of this house sits a man of few words, who is my father, who, with the skill of a ledger entry, applies makeup, as my mother had applied lotion to my limbs. We watch the spectacle, more entertaining than anything on the Etch-a-Sketch zenith. On the chair in this bedroom sits his costume, a potato sack with breasts fashioned from grapefruit halves, and a blonde wig more suited to Harpo than Harlow, as he readies himself for a production of South Pacific, his dark hair protruding through the wig, his voice rising above the chorus of the fans, as he rehearses the song, "There ain't anything you can name that is anything like a dame," proving the lyric with each refrain, as the thin walls echo with laughter. And thank you again to Gloria and Harris for doing this.
Thank you again. Let's have another warm round of applause for Neil Silberblatt. Next up, this person needs, like the other 3 to the other 2, needs almost no introduction, but I'm going to introduce her anyway. Ellen Steinbaum is the author of 4 poetry collections and a one-person play. Her work has been nominated twice for the Pushcart Prize and appears in several anthologies, including Garrison Keillor's Good Poems, American Places, and The Widow's Handbook. An award-winning journalist and former Boston Globe columnist, she writes a blog, Reading and Writing, and the Occasional Recipe, which can be found at her website, ellensteinbaum.com. I give you Ellen.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Gloria and Harris. It's a delight to be here. It's lovely to be reading with Neil and Elizabeth and to see so many terrific faces on the screen. I'm going to give a little shout out perversely to COVID, because after it has decimated us and offered us so much tragedy, it has also taught us how to be connected across miles. And I'm so delighted to see faces of people who are far away, but here we all are together. So I'm going to start with a little shout out to COVID. This is called What the Skin Hungers For. The heartfelt handshake, yes, or hug, of course, but maybe even more, what would have passed unnoticed then? The slight encountering of edges as we leaned into one another on subway seats, enlarged in winter by layers of sweaters, coats, and through our clothes, the stranger's arm was simply presence only, hardly felt, the way in narrow theater seats, a sleeve to sleeve or even briefest brush of flesh to flesh occurred below the level of intrusion, leaving now only a vague, insistent drone, the aching touch of what is absent. So in the second COVID summer, we had the plague or the emergence or whatever, or the excitement of cicadas. And it was just as we were kind of emerging from being completely shut down to kind of tiptoeing out little by little. So this is called Summer 2021 cicadas. Those were my last cicadas, though who can be sure, of course, given my age and their infrequent outings, like scheduled comets and eclipses, they could be penultimate, but most likely my concluding swarm. Every 17 or 13 years they come, both prime numbers, though I think they have a mathematics of their own, each one's 4 to 6 week life, the group's existence for 5 million years, how they arrive by trillions, harmless, loud, and food, high protein, low carb, gluten-free, for anything that eats, with numbers as their sole survival plan. And despite the odds, after the years of quarantine, each one bursts back into the world with gusto and with all their hunger and not a moment's hesitation, unlike me. There were a number of things going on at that particular moment in time, and this is a poem that I wrote in memory of George Perry Floyd Jr. The time it took. For the moment, ignore the subduing, the bringing to ground, and consider only this: what it feels like to hold the position on unsteady surface for that long. Twice as long as you would sit at your kitchen table waiting for French press coffee, longer perhaps than lowered in a pew or beside a hands folded, head bowed child, holding steady, never shifting weight from your one trembling knee, one burning thigh, even as you feel the pulsing upward desperately at first, then less. Consider how it would feel to continue pushing down, to feel the rumble of shouted words, then heavy quiet, while you continue bearing down. Imagine that you lay one steadying hand on ground beside you and feel the stiffness in your legs as you arise from what might, in another circumstance, have been a pose of reverence. And this is a poem that grew out of something I read in a wonderful book by Clint Smith called How the Word is Passed. It was about the existence of Seneca Village, which was a community that existed between 1825 and 1857 in part of what is now Central Park in New York. And it also brings to mind the current questions of who is allowed to talk about what subjects. Now that I know the story, I cannot get it out of my mind, but it is not my story, and I may not have the right to tell it, but I cannot not tell it, cannot, knowing now what I did not know, cannot stay as silent as the years since then have been, as the buried bones have been. I cannot stay silent now that I know, even though it is not my story, and they were not my people who lived together, not my people, but people, free men of property who lived, who could vote, who farmed and prayed and sent their children to the school, until the city said the land, not yet, but someday, right in the middle of the heart, not yet, but someday, ringed by tall buildings, was starting that day, too valuable for small people. And even though it is not my story, but it is a story of people, I will tell how the village was erased by the people, blotted out, how the village was erased, the people blotted out, and how the large city tore up the farms, tore down the homes, the school, 3 churches where Irish, Black, and German sat together in the pews, now driven from the land they worked. And you can read about the land acquired from the squatters who lived right there in the heart of the city on a few squalid farms, even though it is not my story, but it is people's story. And now that I know, I cannot stay silent, cannot get it out of my mind. So hearing Neil read about his father's experience in World War II, I was not planning to read this, but now I have to read this. It's called Letter Home. I love you forever, my father's letter tells her, for 49 pages from the troop ship crossing the Atlantic before they'd ever heard of Anzio. He misses her, the letter says, counting out days of boredom, seasickness, and changing weather, poker games played for matches when cash and cigarettes ran out, a Red Cross package, soap, cards, a mystery book he traded away for the Rubaiyat a bunkmate didn't want. He stood night watch and thought of her. Don't forget the payment for insurance, he says. My mother waits at home with me, waits for the letter he writes day by day, moving farther across the ravenous ocean. She will get it in 3 months, and her fingers will smooth the army stationery to suede. He will come home, stand beside her in the photograph, leaning on crutches, holding me against the rough wool of his jacket. He will sit alone and listen to Aida, and they will pick up their interrupted lives. Years later, she will show her grandchildren a yellow envelope with 49 wilted pages telling her of shimmering sequins on the water, the moonlight catching sudden phosphorescence, the churned wake that stretched a silver trail. So I'm thinking at this moment, here we are with summer, and what could be more wonderful in summer than heirloom tomatoes? So this is a poem that starts with an epigraph by Guy Clark. Only 2 things that money can't buy. That's true love and homegrown tomatoes. Reach into the tangle of leaves, breathe in the green, hold out your hand, be patient, and if the time is right, the weight will drop into your palm. Be patient. This is what was given from the start, a profuse, heavy, abundant, and imperfect fruit. Break it open, no knife, no plate, no polite slices, just break it open. Bite into the deep, sun-warm, simple crimson. Let the juice run down your arm. And this is something that took place just about this exact time of year, almost half century ago. If I can find it, on The Wire. It was just after 7, people rushing to their jobs. Then suddenly the shouts, the pointing, looking up, and there he was, 110 stories in the air, a quarter-mile straight up the towers, not yet finished. The night before, the Grateful Dead had played Roosevelt Stadium, started with Bertha on to Sugar Magnolia, U.S. Blues. The Astros beat the Braves 6-4. The next day, Nixon would resign, but this was morning, August 7th, a Wednesday. And here it was just the wire, narrow, high, and thousands watching as he danced like light between the solid towers. He was arrested, sentenced to make magic in Central Park. Later, he went back, signed his name high on a beam. The president would helicopter from the lawn in just a few days, head back to California, jowled and grimmed. Faye Dunaway got married to someone from the J. Giles band. The new prime minister of Iceland was sworn in, all that same Wednesday. And then nearly 3 decades passed, almost 10,000 days. It was in the morning that day, too. And I'm going to end with 2 poems that have to do with my own personal calendar. Tomorrow is my husband's birthday. And 2 days after that, thank you. And 2 days after that is our anniversary. And a little shout out to Neil, who's a newlywed. And so we have this personal little 3-day holiday. Birthday for Jim. The acorns. Oh, and I just want to say, it's sort of what I wish for all of us. Birthday for Jim. The acorns startle in their loud dropping to the street, loud pinging off the hoods of cars and wood porch railings. And we are at the windows watching as a squirrel has scaled the arbor, swings precariously, stretching out for grapes, taking its fill and letting excess fall to stone. The air is full of herb and earth, umami, 5th taste after salty, bitter, sour, sweet, the taste of dark and deep, of full of fall and hidden wine. And now below the murmuring, the wish swims up warm and sunlit. This. The intervening day, we call it, the day between his birthday and our anniversary, between the beginning of his days and the formal beginning of our days together, between those 2 occasions for cards and cakes, good wishes, celebrations, this one day that has no ritual, just an everyday day. Sandwiched, the day we notice perhaps only because it sits sandwiched between the 2 momentous ones, a day when nothing further is required than our simple gratitude for one more ordinary day. Thank you.
Thank you, Ellen. That was wonderful. We've had a great evening of poetry so far, and our next featured poet will add to it, I'm certain. And Elizabeth S. Wolf's recent books are a collection of partings by Kelsey in 2022, and I Am From, Voices from the Mako House in Ghana, editor 2023. Elizabeth's poetry appears in multiple journals and anthologies and has been nominated for several Pushcart Prizes. Rattle, summer of 2022, featured her Prisoner Express Chapbook Project. Elizabeth is a member of the Scheherazade Project, hashtag 1001 activists. Please welcome Elizabeth S. Wolfe.
And thank you for inviting me here. I'd like to start reading from a collection of partings. And this first poem, which Gloria gave me a shout out, I wrote after I read an in-depth interview in the Washington Post with Marianne Vecchio, who you might know as the girl from the Kent State photo. And that photo has just haunted my life. And you'll also notice there's some lyrics from contemporary songs, including the title, which is How Many More? She was from way down south, Florida, from a town with minarets and an airport, where dreams got caught in the mold of tract houses, row after row. She found the Midwest exotic. She found friends that didn't fight like her father, didn't shame her for feeling. She arrived at Kent State that spring just because it was her next stop. She followed that boy just because he was smiling. She turned to watch someone carry a black flag, and the shots rang out. 60 shots. People dropped. She knelt by her friend as the blood spooled out. She flung her arms and wailed, "Why? Why did you do this?" Because she was young enough to feel and old enough to know something was happening here. A student photographer snapped that scene. And just like that, she wasn't a fey child anymore. She couldn't believe in magic. She became the face of Kent State on May 4th, and we all know because of that fragment of film. We know that girl never again had nothing left to lose. She would never be free of the echo of 6 shots, 4 dead in Ohio, never not be kneeling in flowered jeans, open-mouthed, by a black and white rivulet of blood. Thank you. That poem first appeared in Ibbotson Street, as did this one, and Harris came up with this one for a far better title than I had sent in. This is With Chauffeurs and Drums, and the epigraph is, almost every community that we'd gone to where something horrible had happened, they all had dead grass around them because of the thousands of people that come in and stand on it and ask for justice, ask for peace, and might get some temporary answer. But then eventually that grass comes back just to die again. David Hogue interview, June 2019. With Chauffeurs and Drums. I took 2 buses and walked for half an hour to reach the New England Holocaust Memorial. Hundreds of Jews were there on the slate path, on the Greenway lawn, singing and chanting Kaddish for those who had died in US detention centers. We shouted, "Never again" means never again for anyone. We wept. At the call of the chauffeur, we marched, leaving behind a bin of water bottles and trampled grass. America is no longer America to me. We walked in the streets, carrying signs, banging drums, shouting slogans. Car horns blared as drivers yelled and swerved. The police tried to herd us onto the sidewalks, but we held the streets. These are not normal times. A young boy out with his family asked, "Will all the kids get to go home tomorrow?" His dad swept the boy up onto his shoulders. While we marched in Boston, tanks were trucked into Washington, D.C., and fencing was erected on the mall by the Lincoln Memorial. Fencing bisected the reflecting pool. Only those with invitations were allowed to stand inside. This is no longer America to me. On my way home, a young woman with a small child, both born in another country, waited with their bags in a small alcove at South Station. "That's not the line," an older woman scolded. The mother looked up confused. "You shouldn't be here. You don't even know how to get on the bus." The mother reached for her girl and stood between her child and the anger. "It's okay," I said. "They're with me. I am holding her place in line." Both women stared at me, tear-streaked and disheveled, lame from marching several miles. I put out my hand. "Come, here with me. It's okay," I said, and we became friends. America is not the land of the free that we wish it to be. Last night, somewhere in America, a young brown child with a Mylar blanket, sitting on a cold concrete floor, snot on her clothes and itchy with lice, stared at bars, clutching a rag in her hand and wishing for her mama. Last night, somewhere in America, in a place we used to call "It Can't Happen Here," a patch of grass grew tall and lush under a soft summer sky. And I also have a COVID poem. This was written during the Delta COVID variant, and it was included in Translations, Connected Art Reflecting Empathy or CARE, public art project out of, I believe it was Somerville. It's called The Hand of God. The loneliest man in history didn't die on the dark side of the moon. The loneliest man died prone in Brazil in a hospital bed, struggling for breath, drowning on dry land. Tied to his wrist were 2 surgical gloves filled with warm water, the plump translucent fingers interlaced with his own growing cold. Nurses call it the hand of God. A lonely man answered the phone when I called for tech support. Making conversation, I asked where he was, and he answered softly, "New Delhi." And all the noise in my life hushed to a barely audible thrum. I asked, "How are you? Are you okay?" He paused and then answered, "I'm sorry, madam. I am not okay. I have lost someone every day for 10 days. My chest constricted. I gasped. The man began to weep. "Listen," I said. "Forget why I called. But don't hang up. Keep this line open. Ignore the jabber around you and the call center queue. Ignore all the noise. Use this time as you wish. If you want to talk, talk. If you want to cry, cry. If you want to be silent, I will sit with you, a vessel for your grief." The world spun slowly through the hour he murmured stories, chanting prayers parsed into packets, sent streaming through undersea cables, ping-ponging between far-flung towers, reassembled and presented to my ears intact, a connection carefully curated, as if by the knotted hand of God. And this is Tell Me. And I have a cat who's about to come hog my camera. Tell me. Tell me again about the one-legged vet sitting on a blanket, playing the accordion, the same song over and over. Tell me you were 5 and you thought he was a circus. Tell me again about your grandfather who danced in vaudeville, whose own mother was ashamed back when vaudeville was risque in the land before porn. Tell me how it was. Tell me all your stories. I wasn't always so patient or willing to listen. I didn't know that I would get older and my life would be stored in slices of stories. I remember when my mother would ask if we should drive by the old house where she grew up on Dorset Road, back when between Woburn and Framingham was all farms. I didn't listen. I said no. We mocked her later. Dorset Road, who wants to see Dorset Road? I didn't know then that she could die and it would all be lost. Tell me again what happened while I can still listen before I forget what it means to be kind. And I'd like to switch for a few poems to I Am From, Voices from the Mako House in Ghana. I was fortunate enough earlier this year to be able to travel to the rural region of Volta, Ghana, and give workshops in a boarding house for vulnerable kids aged 9 to 17. So we gave a series of 4 workshops, and I know we're running over, so I'll just read you 2 of these, and then I'll give it back for our Q&A and our open mic. We started with I Am From, those poems, the poem project that was started by a poet laureate in Kentucky several years ago. It's often used with English as a second language classes or teaching empathy because they're really easy to grasp. And if you don't know that you're good at poetry yet, everyone has memories of where you're from, and there's a lot of sensory images and there's a lot of nouns. So we started with this and it worked wonderfully because the kids all were more confident after they wrote their first poem. This is from Edmund. He's 10. I'm going to murder the name of his town because I don't speak Ewe. And this is I Am From. I am from Akplamfu, where wonderful farms are located. I am from mud houses with thatch roofs. I am from trees where trees smells like apples and rivers flow with milk. I am from a shed with bows and arrows for hunting. I am from a thick bush with heavy rainfalls. Another prompt we gave, we read a poem by a Nigerian poet, The Woman in the Well, and it talked about the stories in her village about a woman who would appear at a well at midday at certain times. And so then we asked the kids, what stories did you hear growing up in your villages? What stories did you hear from the elders? And do you still believe them? Do you believe them and not believe them? And these came up with some of our more dramatic poems. And this is by Safako, who is 16, The Man in the Hut. If you had grown up in my village, you might have heard about the man who lives in a small dark hut with a human head and a body of a snake. My grandmom, the queen of the village, said the man was born by a beautiful woman. The man always stays in the hut, and when he is hungry, he screams like a cobra. The people of the village said any kids should not go near the hut because of the man in the hut. They said he had a big head and a snake voice, and also there is a small window in the hut, which he peeps his head through and feels the air. They say he does that especially at midday. It is also said that he is just a human being like us, but we should not go near it. The hut is located in the middle of the village, so they said we should not even pass by the hut because he has dangerous eyes. And when he sees you with his eyes, you will be blind, or you become really poor and needy. I don't believe in him, but I never go near the hut at midday because you never know. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Oh, I love your kitty cat. So pretty.
She's been waiting for
great.
her moment.
Well, I'm glad we all got to see her. And now I will turn it over to Harris to close us out.
So I want to say thank you to the three wonderful features that we had this evening. Let's have another round of applause for Neil Silberblatt, Ellen Steinbaum, and Ellen S. Wolf. Elizabeth.